It was the last period of the day, and the classroom was a ticking time bomb, the tension crackling in the air. Mrs. Parker, the math teacher, slammed a thick textbook onto the desk, her eyes narrowing at the back of the room. Elizabeth, solve it. Now. The whole class went silent, but the murmur of curiosity was palpable. All eyes turned to Elizabeth, the quiet girl sitting in the corner. She never volunteered to answer questions, never seemed to care about schoolwork, never participated in the daily banter. In fact, most of the students had written her off as just another average teenager, always in the shadows. But today, something in Mrs. Parker's voice was different. It wasn't a challenge. It was a dare. The equation that lay on the board, a monstrous tangle of numbers and symbols, was something that even the top students had avoided. It was meant to be unsolvable in under 20 minutes. Elizabeth didn't flinch. Her eyes, wide and calm, scanned the equation for less than a second. And then, with a soft sigh, she stood up. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice so quiet that it barely made it to the back of the room. But it was enough to make Mrs. Parker pause, her lips curling into a smug smile. The class held their breath. Something was about to happen. "How can you not see it?" Mrs. Parker's voice cracked, louder now. Her face twisted in disbelief as the class erupted into chaos. Elizabeth stood frozen at the blackboard, her pen hovering over the final step of the complex equation. She could feel the weight of every student's gaze, every whisper, and the burning frustration of the teacher behind her. How did this all get so out of hand? Was she about to expose herself for something no one could understand? Or was she about to break in front of them all, crumbling under the weight of a challenge that no one expected her to face? Elizabeth had always been invisible. At least, that's what she'd convinced herself. The shy girl who never spoke up, who never drew attention to herself, and who always kept her head down in class. School was a monotonous blur of textbooks and tests. Nothing extraordinary. She had no dreams of grandeur, no lofty ambitions. Just a desire to stay under the radar and get by. But deep down, something in her was different. Her mind raced in ways that no one could comprehend, especially not her teachers. They dismissed her as a lazy student, barely passing by, too quiet to care. But it wasn't laziness. It was fear. Fear of being too different. Fear of being exposed as the person she truly was, a genius. Because the last time anyone had paid attention to her abilities, really paid attention, it had shattered everything. Her mother had been proud, her father uneasy, and her peers, well, they had been frightened. She learned early on that brilliance was a dangerous thing. Too much and people couldn't handle it. So she chose to hide it. When Mrs. Parker challenged her to solve the equation, it wasn't out of the blue. Elizabeth had been hearing whispers for weeks. Whispers of her supposed laziness, of how she never tried, of how she always skimmed by in class with little effort. She'd been quiet about it. But the sneers, the eye rolls, the dismissive glances, it had all been building. And now Mrs. Parker was pushing her, forcing her. She wasn't just asking a question. She was mocking her, testing her, expecting her to fail. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she stood before the equation, but her mind clicked into focus. No one would ever expect her to finish it in time. No one ever did. They all assumed she was just like the rest. But this time she wouldn't let them control the narrative. "Do it, Elizabeth," Mrs. Parker taunted from the front of the room, her voice dripping with condescension. "Let's see if you're really as smart as everyone seems to think." Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the pressure mounting, the tension rising in the classroom. Her classmates stared at her with a mix of disbelief and curiosity, waiting for her to stumble, to fail like they all secretly expected. But Elizabeth was already beyond the point of caring about their expectations. With swift, fluid movements, she began to write out the solution. Her mind was a storm of numbers and patterns, each step more intricate than the last. The classroom was silent, the only sound her pen scratching against the board. As she approached the final answer, Mrs. Parker's voice broke through, sharp and accusing. "You really think you can solve that?" she snapped, her tone dismissive. Elizabeth hesitated only for a moment. Then she wrote the final answer. It was flawless. There was a long, pregnant silence. The air seemed to hold its breath. And then, Mrs. Parker let out a harsh laugh, one filled with disbelief. "You actually think this is right?" she scoffed. "This is a university-level problem. You couldn't possibly." Elizabeth turned, meeting her teacher's eyes. "Check it. It's correct." For the first time, Mrs. Parker's smug smile faltered. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the equation. The room was still. The entire class was holding their breath. Mrs. Parker's face shifted. The shock was too much for her to hide. She looked back at Elizabeth, her voice strained, now far less confident. I need to check this," she muttered. As Mrs. Parker pulled out her phone, frantically typing the solution into a calculator, Elizabeth felt a rush of conflicting emotions. The weight of their gazes felt suffocating. Was this the moment she would finally be exposed? Or was it the moment everything would change? What would they think of her now? Would they understand the truth? But the silence lingered too long. Finally, Mrs. Parker's voice broke through the tension. "This is impossible." Elizabeth's stomach dropped. It wasn't just the equation that was impossible. It was everything that came with the revelation. She had done it. She had shattered the facade of normalcy she'd worked so hard to maintain. Her classmates stared at her now, a mixture of awe and fear on their faces. They had no idea what to make of it, and neither did she. Elizabeth turned away from Mrs. Parker, the room buzzing with voices. Her classmates were whispering, pointing, trying to process what they had just witnessed. But Elizabeth wasn't finished yet. She wasn't just going to stand there and let them all walk away with their assumptions about her. "Let me tell you something," Elizabeth said, her voice steady, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've been hiding in plain sight my entire life, but I won't hide anymore. I'm not just another student. I'm not your joke, and I'm not here to make you feel comfortable. I am what I am." The room fell into a stunned silence. The bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, but Elizabeth didn't move immediately. She stood in the hallway, her fingers still gripping the straps of her backpack, her mind racing. There was a strange weightlessness in her chest, a mix of relief and something else, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Pride. As she walked toward the exit, she could still hear the buzz of conversation behind her, muffled voices trying to process what had just happened. "Did you see that? She solved it perfectly. Is she some kind of genius or something? I never knew she was that smart. All this time we thought she was just quiet. But wow." Her heart swelled with a sense of validation she hadn't realized she needed. The world wasn't looking at her like the girl who disappeared into the background anymore. She wasn't just the invisible one. She was Elizabeth, the girl who could do the impossible. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for the right moment, she saw him. It was Chris, the guy who had been in her math class since freshman year, always joking around, always charming, but never taking things seriously. He had always been nice to her, but it was clear he didn't really know who she was. But now there was a change in the air. His eyes met hers across the courtyard, and instead of the usual dismissive glance, his expression softened. He took a few steps toward her, his voice hesitant but sincere. You really are incredible, Elizabeth," he said, the awe clear in his voice. For a split second, Elizabeth almost felt like a weight was lifting from her. She was finally seen for the first time, not just as the quiet girl, but as someone capable of something extraordinary. "Thanks," she replied with a small smile. For once, she didn't feel the need to shrink or apologize for who she was. She wasn't perfect, but she didn't have to hide who she was anymore. Not anymore. As she left the school grounds, Elizabeth knew something had shifted. There would be whispers, no doubt. There would be expectations, questions, and maybe even some resistance. But the truth was, she was ready. She wasn't running from her brilliance anymore. But just as she reached the gate, the sound of footsteps behind her made her pause. She turned to see Mrs. Parker walking briskly toward her, her posture stiff but almost apologetic. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. Was this it? Was she going to be punished, called out for showing up her teacher in front of the entire class? But when Mrs. Parker stopped in front of her, she wasn't angry. She wasn't even condescending. I owe you an apology, Mrs. Parker said quietly. I underestimated you. I should have known better. Her voice softened, an almost reluctant admiration in her words. You have a gift, Elizabeth, and I've been too blinded by my own insecurities to see it. Elizabeth blinked, the shock of the moment leaving her speechless for a second. It's okay, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I understand. I didn't expect you to see me. But Mrs. Parker shook her head. I was wrong. You shouldn't hide that brilliance, Elizabeth. You shouldn't hide who you are. You should own it. And for the first time, Elizabeth felt like the walls that had surrounded her for so long were finally coming down. The world was opening up, and she was ready to walk into it, head held high. With a final nod, Elizabeth turned toward the horizon, ready for the next chapter of her life. As she walked away, she heard Mrs. Parker call after her, a hint of warmth in her voice. Good luck, Elizabeth. You've earned it. And Elizabeth didn't look back. As Elizabeth stepped into her future, what do you think? Could you relate to her journey of breaking free from expectations and embracing your true self? Or maybe you've had a moment when the world finally saw you for who you really are. If you've ever been underestimated or felt like you were hiding your potential, share your thoughts with us below. What's one thing you've learned from Elizabeth's story that you're taking with you today? And if you want more stories that inspire, challenge, and make you think, don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for the next one. You never know when your own Elizabeth moment might come.